Good afternoon. Let's do some business. We are doing it live, doing more at 4 weekday afternoons. We get right down to business with the news-driven hour right after Ben Shapiro and just before the 790 KBC News Blitz with Randy Wang at 5. Mottek On Money, live on the air, 790 KBC, streaming live online worldwide at kbc.com and your on-demand Mottek On Money podcast, kbc.com, Apple, iTunes, and all your favorite podcast platforms. Rough start to the new week and the new month of September, coming off the 3-day Labor Day holiday weekend. Sure felt like a manic Monday today, but was a tough Tuesday coming off the holiday weekend. Stocks sliding right after the opening bell on Wall Street and finishing sharply lower to kick off an historically tough month of the year, by the way, for the market as investors took in the weak manufacturing report we got today, reigniting concerns about an economic slowdown. The Dow coming in for a closing loss of 626 points, settling at 40,937, coming off the all-time high we hit last week to end the month of August. The S&P 500 pulling back about 120 points today to finish at 5,529, coming off its near all-time high last week. And the NASDAQ tumbled 577 points, a drop of 3.3% for that index, settling at 17,136. All three of the major averages seeing their worst daily percentage drop since August 5th when we had that big market sell-off. The market got hit today right out of the gate on the Institute for Supply Management's Manufacturing Index, showing the manufacturing side of the economy dropped for the fifth straight month in the month of August. Weak manufacturing also weighing on Treasury yields today, sending bond prices higher. The yield in the 10-year note moved to 3.84%. We haven't seen a day like this since the global stock market meltdown in early August when the unwinding of Japanese yen carry trade and a weaker than expected July jobs report sent markets reeling a month ago. Investors coming off the Labor Day weekend also waiting for the big news later this week that could give us more clues as to the size of the Fed's September interest rate cut that's widely expected. September, by the way, historically the worst month of the year in terms of stock market performance, which many investors think today's market decline to kick off the month is not worth sounding alarm bells over, but we'll get some more insights on that in just a moment. History showing the first half of September has usually been relatively calm compared with the second half of the month. October, by the way, also known for its volatility, of course. Big tech names getting hit hard today. Losses led by AI giant NVIDIA. NVIDIA shedding about $280 billion of market cap today, dropping more than $11 to 108. And after the closing bell, looks like NVIDIA is sliding to around 106. We'll take a closer look at that here in just a moment. Despite the horrific developments in the Middle East over the weekend, including the execution of an American hostage held by Hamas and ongoing threats by Iran to attack Israel, U.S. and global benchmark crude oil prices moving sharply lower today. We did see the price of Brent crude in London, that's the global benchmark, down nearly $4 today, back to 73 and change, a drop of nearly 5%. And we see West Texas Intermediate in New York dropping more than $3 to 70 and change, a drop of 4.4%. Coming up later this hour, I'll talk about the economy and small business. I'll be joined live by Chris Pilkerton, former acting administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration during a critical time of the Trump administration. Chris Pilkerton, also the author of the new book, Plandemic, COVID, PPP, and a Small Business Prescription for the Next Global Economic Crisis. Chris Pilkerton will be joining me live later this hour. Tax policy getting lots of attention these days in the presidential race, with President Trump calling on no federal taxes on tips, and now Vice President Harris taking a page from President Trump's playbook, now also calling for no taxes on tips. I'll discuss that and more with Ted Rossman, senior industry analyst at Bankrate.com, coming up live later this hour. But first, on your money, the markets, the economy, and the whole works now. Joining us live, the one and only John NAJARIAN, Dr. J, as he's known on the major financial networks, co-founder of Market Rebellion. He's got the laser eyes on, too, following the cryptos closely. And his new book with his brother Pete is It's Not an Option. Learning how to trade options is no longer an option. It's a necessity. John NAJARIAN, thank you very much for coming to the line this afternoon.
It's my pleasure, as always, Frank. It's an interesting day, certainly, with all the news you just cited, as well as the after-hours news on NVIDIA and so forth, or NVIDIA, depending how you want to say it. It's a very interesting trading day.
Most definitely, and a down day, the biggest down day since that meltdown about a month ago. Dow down more than 600. The NASDAQ down nearly 600. Big percentage drop there. Give us your impressions of what we just went through here.
Well, as virtually all Americans know, we did not open for business in most cases yesterday. And the rest of the world, of course, does not observe our Labor Day. They have various other holidays throughout their years for observing the workers who put in hours and, in some cases, their entire lives to the service economy. But in this case, it's just America that observed our Labor Day. So, in other words, Europe and Asia, there's really three main trade zones in the world that trade in 8-hour increments, and it's really the United States. Then we pass the torch over to Asia. Then Asia passes the torch over to the UK and the rest of Europe. And those markets yesterday, Frank, that did trade were pretty much down across the board. So the idea coming into today was that absent a significant positive in the United States, we would trade to the downside because it truly is a global trade. And indeed, that's what we did. We traded to the downside, reacting to weakness in China, their PMI, purchasing managers, and so forth, as well as the consumer confidence numbers out of China. And later this week, of course, we get the August employment data coming our way on Friday, as well as some other key metrics. I don't think there's a doubt that the U.S. will cut interest rates at the September 18th meeting. But nonetheless, it could be already priced in, and that's what a lot of people are fearing at this point. If it's already priced in and the markets somehow then feel that they needed more, well, the likely event is that we go to the downside after that. And that's what today's reaction in the market, I think, was all about.
Thank you for that excellent analysis. As always, we're on the line with John NAJARIAN. And John NAJARIAN, today we got the news, a disappointing reading on manufacturing, notable here in the Los Angeles area, because many people don't know this, that Los Angeles is the largest manufacturing region in the United States. So anytime we get a reading on manufacturing, it's impacting this area as well. And that key barometer of factories negative for the fifth straight month, signaling the manufacturing side of the economy is still in a deep slump, down for several months now, down about 5 months, I believe it is. So what's your assessment there, and is this leading to new recession talk here?
Well, certainly every time we see a softening to this extent of the economy, that is one of the conversations that comes up, Frank, as usual. You're right on point. And China has had 4 consecutive months of contraction. Now, it's one of the reasons we saw crude oil futures down 4%, because obviously China and the United States are the 2 largest consumers of crude oil-based product. So whether or not it's the crude oil itself, whether it's diesel, the distillates that go from Jet A all the way down to gasoline for our cars, this is something that we watch closely. And I'm not saying that U.S. consumers are cutting back on driving because it's too expensive. I'm saying that China, in particular, has cut back rather dramatically on their consumption. And would they start putting it into their equivalent of our strategic petroleum reserve? Yes, they would, but probably in the 60s, not in the 70 per barrel range where crude oil and WTI are right now.
On there live with John NAJARIAN. Getting back to NVIDIA here, we see it down to more than $11 today, back to 108, and moving lower in after-hours trading. Big drop in market cap, eye-popping drop in market cap for that stock here in one shot. I saw one write-up that says NVIDIA stock usually performs worst in September. What's your assessment here of NVIDIA?
Well, my assessment is that somehow, somebody got an inkling that the U.S. was about to charge them with some sort of antitrust issue. Now, we don't know, so I'm not going to speculate on air about what that charge may be, but apparently the issue with NVIDIA, both during the day today and in the after hours, which, as you said, drove it down through 106 in the after hours, closed at roughly, closer to 110, 111, or at least was trading near there until this rumor came out. The charge that maybe they will be subject of a U.S., not a foreign antitrust, but a U.S. antitrust investigation, has NVIDIA shares the weakest we've seen since that August 5th day that drove NVIDIA down all the way through $91 a share. So do I think it's all over for them? No, I don't. And I would say that there were a lot of speculative buyers of downside trades, or in other words, puts, that certainly think that NVIDIA goes significantly lower over the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Fast forward to the present. Thank you for that. And NVIDIA shares are moving lower in after-hours trading, down about 2% to 106 and change. And on the news that you referenced, John NAJARIAN, after Bloomberg reported, this is sourced is Bloomberg here, reporting that the company received a subpoena from the Department of Justice as part of an antitrust investigation. The slide coming after NVIDIA dropped nearly 10% during regular trading, wiping $279 billion off its market cap. According to that Bloomberg report, the DOJ investigation has not reached the stage of a formal complaint, and the agency is asking questions about whether NVIDIA makes it harder to switch to other suppliers of AI chips. NVIDIA, it should be noted, has more than 80% of the market for data center AI chips, according to industry estimates. So thanks for bringing us up to date on all of that. Getting to the exciting stuff now, the cryptos, which you follow closely. We've seen another wild ride for crypto in the last several days. Bitcoin right now, let me take a look. Down just below 58K here at the moment. Ethereum at around 2,400. What's your assessment of the crypto action?
Well, there's a lot of speculation that cryptos will start reacting to the political contest going on between President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris over the next several weeks and months. Obviously, that's driven by the idea that President Trump is a huge supporter of Bitcoin and cryptos, and Kamala Harris has said she is not against it, but she has not shown up at any of these industry events, like, for instance, the most recent Bitcoin conference in Nashville. So the fact that Bitcoin was down 2.5% today, falling under 60,000 again, as you say, even breaking through 58,000. Ethereum also trading to the downside by about 3.8%, down to about 24.47. Both those numbers, not what the crypto folks would like to see. They would like to see, of course, those alternatives to fiat moving higher. The reason they haven't seen that, quite frankly, is that there's a big division between the two candidates, the one that really supports crypto and the one that supports USDC. In other words, the central bank digital currency, which is what Kamala Harris supports, versus crypto itself, which is what Donald Trump supports. So I would think, absent something else in the world as far as news, whether it's, as you say, the hostage, sadly, that was the U.S. hostage that was killed over in Gaza this past few days. Those sorts of things have people very nervous about political winds blowing in a particular direction. Right now, that direction seems to be deepening and deepening on the war side, whether it's Gaza, whether it's the Ukraine conflict with Russia, or Russia conflict with Ukraine, however you prefer to view that. And those are not standalone events. Those are events that traders in the markets of fiat, of precious metals, and of crypto are keeping a close eye on.
On your live with John NAJARIAN, excellent. Appreciate your assessment on that. Anything that's top of mind in the crypto space at the moment that's getting your attention among all the coins, meme coins and tokens, and of course the bigger names that you track?
Well, I mean, I've talked about Parlay before, and Parlay is a very interesting new entrant onto the scene, because Parlay allows people to basically create meme coins almost out of thin air. I mean, they're able to do it with the most, if you will, ease of any of these sorts of events. So I think overall, when you're looking at something like Parlay, this is something that is trading myparlay.com, myparlay.com. This is, I think, something that people will definitely gravitate to the same way they gravitated towards Wix, Wix.com, for websites and things like that. When you're creating a website, most of us don't have the skill set to basically create out of whole cloth a brand new website for a company. Well, imagine how many people would like to create a meme coin for their business. Well, that's exactly what this myparlay.com can do. And that was a big thing that I was taken with at the Nashville Bitcoin conference. And I think it continues to be something that people are focused on, Frank.
On the live with John NAJARIAN, and we see the VIX index, by the way, spiking 38% today. That's the Wall Street Fear Index, the Volatility Index, and of course you're an options guy, and you've got that great new book out as well. It's Not an Option is the name of the book. What are your thoughts about volatility at this point, and what do we need to know about options here?
Well, we certainly did see a big move out of the VIX. I mean, for weeks and weeks, the VIX was at 12 or roughly 12%. Now it is up at 20.71. It is up 33% today alone. That is a very big move. The volatility index measures how much the S&P is expected to go up or down. Generally, and I'm sure most of your fans, Frank, and there are many, many millions of those, most people would say the VIX rises on uncertainty in the market, on fear in the market. So the fact that it's up 33% today is indeed something that people are worried about. If it flattens out at this level, roughly 20 and 72 cents where it is in the after hours, that would be a good thing. If it does not and continues higher, it could not so much threaten the 65 reading that we got a month ago, but certainly it could go up over 30. And that's something that traders and hedge funds watch very closely. So over the next several days, this is a very important issue to watch, the VIX itself, VIX.
All right, before I let you off the hook here, John NAJARIAN, briefly, let me ask you the big question now. Any specific places where you are putting money now and or taking it off the table?
Well, I think over the weekend we had a lot of interest in everything from Amazon.com to eBay. So I would say those two, as well as PayPal, PYPL. In other words, all of which I've described are not bricks and mortars. I would love to see bricks and mortar stocks catch more of a wind at their back, but we're not seeing it right now. We're seeing a lot of interest in the, if you will, the internet or e-commerce side of the markets. Now, that's great because it does actually employ a lot of people to deliver and to fulfill all of these purchases that are made online, but it is not nearly the same numbers of people as people walking through the door into retail stores. So this is something that I think we're going to be talking about, Frank, over the next several months leading up to the election.
Fantastic, John. Thank you very much for taking the call this afternoon. I always wish we had even more time here. You're terrific, and look forward to our next conversation here. John NAJARIAN, Dr. J, as he's known on the major financial networks, co-founder of Market Rebellion. His new book with his brother Pete, It's Not an Option. Learning how to trade options is no longer an option. It's a necessity. And be sure to catch John NAJARIAN on X, formerly known as Twitter, at John NAJARIAN. Thank you very much, John, for joining us live here on Mottek On Money on 790 KABC. Mottek On Money continues 790 KABC. Rough start to the holiday-shortened week on Wall Street. The Dow plunging 626 points, selling at 40,937. Worst day in about a month. The S&P 500 kicking off the month of September, down 119 points at 5,529. And the NASDAQ sliding 577 points at 17,136. The Dow coming off its all-time high we hit last week. The yield in the 10-year note now 3.84%. NVIDIA in the spotlight, down today more than $11 at 108. And after hours sliding some more down to about 106. Apple down more than 6 today at 222 and change. We see Meta, Facebook, down nearly $10 at 511 and change. Tesla sliding 351 at $210.60 a share. Bitcoin down about 200 at 57,800. Ethereum down 12 to 2,440, and Doge at 10 cents. Gold, by the way, still flirting with its record high, 2,524 and change, and silver at 28.39. Now the latest news here in 790 KABC. Mottek On Money continues here in 790 KABC. Standing tall for small, he did it. Chris Pilkerton, former acting administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration, stood tall for small business during a critical time of the Trump administration during the pandemic and the economic shutdowns. He's written a new book about that experience. The book is called Plandemic, COVID, PPP, and a Small Business Prescription for the Next Global Economic Crisis. Chris Pilkerton, thank you very much for taking the call here this afternoon.
Frank, it's great to be with you again.
Wonderful to have you with us. It was great seeing you at the Milken Institute Global Conference earlier this year when you tipped us off that this book was coming out. Congratulations on the release of the book now. Take it from the top. Tell us about your unique and unprecedented experience during the pandemic days when the economy was shut down and how you helped small businesses survive during that difficult time.
Well, Frank, you were the very first person in the media that I had a chance to talk to about this at the Milken Conference, so it's great to be able to circle back with you. So I remember back to those days like so many other Americans did in March of 2020. And I had been leading the SBA for about a year and had the chance to go over to the White House to work on the Paycheck Protection Program. And one of the things that I had done when I was there was spend a lot of time with mayors, with governors, with county council people who were calling the White House to have conversations about what they could be doing for their communities. And after we made it through the pandemic and the $800 billion PPP program, as well as a lot of the other pandemic support initiatives for small business, I wanted to sit down and take some time to think about, what went right, what can we do better in a circumstance going forward? Should it be a health pandemic, or should there just be a general economic crisis, which obviously happens much more frequently? So I spent some time and really just researched for about a year and a half, 2 years, with both former colleagues as well as academics and other individuals, and came up with a policy and a plan that, as the title says, is Plandemic. And essentially what the book is it's sort of a first aid kit for the small business community. Because, look, small businesses are so strong. They're so resilient. They did such an incredible job during the pandemic, kept people employed, and continued to push products. Some even kind of changed their entire business model to help support the supply chain. Apparel companies were turning into companies for protective equipment. And they will really continue to be a huge part of the American economy and sort of a first responder of sorts alongside the amazing health workers. And so what this book does is take a look at some of the things that we can do in the U.S. to strengthen our small business ecosystems now, really at the local level. And these are things that the small businesses, the local chambers can get together and go to their communities, go to their cities, go to their councils, go to their states, and then ultimately to the federal government and say, look, from a preparation perspective, these are best practices and things that we can do. And quite honestly, in my experience in Washington and across all the states, small business owners are so important. And because of that, they have this huge voice. And it doesn't matter where you stand on the political aisle, left or right, they're always going to be listened to by the elected officials. And I think if we're ready for the next one, not only will small businesses be more resilient, when I say the next one, a pandemic, but quite honestly, like I said before, any kind of crisis will continue to make them strong. If you think the U.S. government in that circumstance is sort of like a doctor-patient relationship, and as you mentioned, it's called a prescription for small business. There's preventative medicine, so to speak, that we can do now to prepare our small business community that when something does happen, it won't be as bad as it was.
On there live with Chris Pilkerton, former acting administrator of the Small Business Administration, and the book is called Plandemic. Since you had a front row seat to all of this, maybe you can share with us. It must have been very, very dramatic when it was decided to shut down the U.S. economy. Tell us how you handled that situation and how you went through that process.
Well, it was fascinating because you remember back to 2019, for example, the economy was absolutely booming. The tax cuts had come into play. We had, really strong deregulation, and unemployment across all demographics was at historic lows. And so really, almost overnight, things changed. The unemployment rate went up absolutely, dramatically. And there was concern at that time that we didn't quite know how high it was going to get. And the reality is this: when you think about like a banking crisis going back to the Great Recession, that's about the amount of money in the system and the ability for banks and other groups to be able to lend. With a health pandemic, it's very different. You're relying on the health advice of doctors and experts because you don't know when something's going to end. And there was important things like Operation Warp Speed that helped to create the vaccine. So the process that we had in place was incredibly unique. And that's what Paycheck Protection Program was really all about. And if you ask experts on the left and right, it was one of those things that was created out of the circumstances of the PPP. It hadn't been, or out of the COVID crisis. It hadn't been done before. And what I did in this book is examine, what worked, what challenges were there at the PPP over the course of the past few months as it kind of was rolled out, and then looked at what other countries did. So really, this is not just something that looks at the U.S. Or just our local economies, but it looked at what other countries did and how they were able to sustain their small business system, how certain countries were able to maintain relatively low unemployment rates because of the programs they put into place. And so what I'm asking for in this book is that small businesses go to their elected officials and implement this plan. And it's not one of these academic textbooks that says, small businesses are great. We all agree with that. It's an actionable plan. And to me, that's the most important thing, because when it comes to small business or any kind of important operation, hope isn't a strategy. You need to have an execution plan.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, and we look forward to reading the book. It's called Plandemic, COVID, PPP, and a Small Business Prescription for the Next Global Economic Crisis. Thank you very much for writing this thoughtful book and creating a playbook. God forbid we face a similar situation down the line. Chris Pilkerton, the former acting administrator of the United States Small Business Administration during a critical time of the Trump administration. And once again, the book is called Plandemic. Chris Pilkerton, thank you very much for joining us live here this afternoon.
Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very, very much. And right after the freeways, we go now on 790 KBC. Mottek On Money continues here on 790 KBC. Rough start to the new month and the holiday-shortened week on Wall Street, with the Dow tumbling more than 600 points at the closing bell today. The NASDAQ closing down nearly 600. This on a disappointing reading on manufacturing, and now new speculation as to how much the Fed might cut rates at their big meeting next month. And, of course, we'll also be getting the new reading on jobs at the end of this week. So that's the big enchilada of monthly economic reports. So we'll be tuned in for that. Tax policy, of course, also getting lots of attention and uncertainty about this presidential season, also weighing on the markets lately. A lot of attention focused in the presidential race on tax policy, with President Trump calling on no federal taxes on tips, and now Vice President Harris taking a page from President Trump's playbook and now also calling for no taxes on tips. Joining us live now is Ted Rossman, Senior Industry Analyst at Bankrate.com. Ted, thanks very much for taking the call here this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, first on tax policy, it looks like this idea of no federal taxes on tips is a popular one. And President Trump originally had proposed this, and now Vice President Harris has latched onto it. Tell us what we need to know about this idea.
I do fear some unintended consequences here. Some for the government. This would reportedly add to the deficit, about $100 billion to $200 billion in the case of the Harris plan, about $150 billion to $250 billion in the case of the Trump plan. Now, I know the average tipped worker doesn't care that much about Uncle Sam's finances, but, I also worry about this at the individual level. For example, a lot of people are not tipping well. We've done research into this, and we found that 60% of Americans have a negative view of tipping. About a third feel that tipping culture is out of control. People are tipping noticeably less in recent years. There was a brief groundswell during the pandemic, but it's much worse now. Only about a third of Gen Zers always tip at sit-down restaurants. Only about half of millennials always tip at sit-down restaurants. We're seeing a bit of a tipping backlash, and that's part of what I worry about, that if there's more incentive to make tips a larger percentage of workers' wages and, isn't this great, it's tax-free, what if that pie shrinks? There is evidence that the pie is shrinking. I also worry that there's not a lot of safety net to this sort of thing. You don't usually get paid vacation or retirement benefits or health insurance or things like that. If more of the burden is pushed onto the customer to make up this employee's wages, I just think that might be a dangerous place to be.
And now there's tipping even before you get the service, right? Where they whip around that little iPad or that little thing there where you have those, the menu comes up, and even before you get your food or you know what the service is going to be, which could impact the service, right? If you put zero tip and then person who's serving you knows that they're not getting anything extra, you expect a lousy service after that, right?
Right. That's some of what I worry about. Some people are annoyed by that. The federal tipped minimum wage is just $2.13 an hour. I mean, I know it's higher in many states and cities, but still, there's not much of a safety net there nationally. I just wonder, tipping has already become a hidden surcharge of sorts. It's a way for some businesses to get away with paying their staff less, and they hope the customer makes up the difference. And it's been that way for a long time at restaurants, but increasingly that's the way a lot of coffee shops are operating and other establishments. I mean, I was asked to tip at a self-checkout machine at Newark Airport, and I was asked to tip at a pick-your-own strawberry farm. It's that sort of thing that's giving tipping a bad name. So I do just worry that even if this policy sounds very friendly, if it really leads more people to become classified as tipped workers, is that really where we want to be headed? That does feel like a precarious place. Customers don't really like it. The workers may not make out as well as they think. We should remember, too, that about a third of tipped workers are already not paying federal taxes because their incomes fall below the threshold. So it just feels to me that this may be one of these things that sounds better than it really is.
On the air live with Ted Rossman, Senior Industry Analyst at Bankrate.com. Zooming out to the bigger tax picture, President Trump basically flat out saying there'll be lower taxes in his administration if he's reelected, and Vice President Harris, Biden-Harris team basically pledging higher taxes. Give us your assessment of what voters will be facing here.
Yeah, there are definitely some semantics involved. I mean, the Harris camp has talked about not raising taxes on people who make less than $400,000 a year. One big thing that could be sorted out by the next Congress is the fate of that state and local tax deduction. That's been a big deal, especially in high-cost coastal states where the fact that those deductions have been capped has actually been a net loss for some of these individuals. So, that'll be interesting to see if that goes anywhere, potentially taking that back to the way it was. The child tax credit is another big one to watch. The Harris camp has signaled a willingness to perhaps expand that. Remember, briefly during the pandemic, that $2,000 per kid credit was expanded to either $3,000 or $3,600 a year, depending on the age of the child. That could potentially make a big difference, too. if something like that were to be expanded. Now, of course, there's always the issue of how you're going to pay for all this, and there's going to be a lot of wrangling, regardless of who wins the White House and the Congress. But, yeah, definitely some interesting tax developments on the potential horizon here.
All right, and fast forward to the news today. Disappointing reading on manufacturing, new concerns about the economy, and nervousness about what we might get on Friday with a jobs report and the Fed's next move. But give us your assessment here of what we might expect here next month when the Fed meets and makes its decision on interest rates. What are you guys expecting there?
It feels like a quarter point is a definite. A half a point is still in play. It's interesting, though, because certain products have already started to come down, like mortgage rates, for example. Last fall, the average 30-year fixed-rate mortgage briefly hit 8%, and that's already down to about 6.5%. And the improvement is because mortgages track 10-year Treasury rates, and those have started to come down. Investors are reading the tea leaves that the Fed's going to be bringing rates down. So that's actually one product that moves in advance. And there's still plenty of room to go lower, of course. Maybe a year from now, that figure's in the mid to high fives. I mean, that would open up some refinancing activity. That would make it easier for buyers. Not as good as when rates were 3 or 4% a few years ago. But, something in the fives would be a lot better than the 6s or 7s. So mortgages.
Ted, thank you very much for that thorough assessment. Look forward to staying in touch with you and getting updates here. Ted Rossman, Senior Industry Analyst at Bankrate.com, live with us here on Mottek On Money on 790 KBC. Stay tuned now for the 790 KBC News Blitz with Randy Wang. And I'll be back with more at 4 tomorrow afternoon here on Mottek On Money, 790 KBC.
Hey, it's Rich Eisen here. Join me and my compadre, Chris Brockman, every Monday on the Overreaction Monday podcast.
A 2023 last place team will win a playoff game this year.
I'm taking the Cincinnati Bengals to be that team. If you gave me
safe bet.
If you said 2 last place teams, I might say that's an overreaction. Come react or overreact with us. This one makes it much easier. So thank you for making it easier.
Well, tune in next week.
Overreaction Monday, wherever you listen.